The morning of December 16, 1944, near the Belgian village of Krinkelt, a Sherman tank commander named Lieutenant William McConaughey pressed his face against the frigid periscope of his M4A1, scanning the tree line through sheets of falling snow. His tank, part of the 2nd Infantry Division's attached armour, had pulled into a defensive position along a rutted farm road barely wide enough for the Sherman's 9-foot width. The engine ticked as it cooled. Inside the turret, the air smelled of gun oil, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of fear that no amount of training could eliminate. McConaughey had been told the Germans were finished. Intelligence reports filtering down through division headquarters suggested the Wehrmacht was spent, its armoured reserves exhausted by months of retreat across France and Belgium. The Ardennes sector was supposed to be quiet, a rest area where green divisions could gain experience and battered units could recover. But at 05:30 that morning, the horizon had erupted in orange fire as thousands of German artillery pieces opened up along an 80-mile front, and now McConaughey could hear the distinctive squeal of tank tracks somewhere in the fog ahead. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He did not know it yet, but concealed in the forest less than 400 yards from his position sat a Panzer Mark V Panther, its long 75mm gun already trained on the road where American armour would have to pass. The Panther's commander, Oberleutnant Hans Becker of the 1st SS Panzer Division, had chosen his position with the methodical care that characterized German armoured doctrine. His tank sat hull down behind a slight rise, camouflaged with cut pine branches, its frontal armour angled to maximize deflection. Becker had fought from Normandy to the Belgian border, and he understood with bitter clarity that German tanks now survived through ambush and concealment, not through direct engagement with Allied armour that outnumbered his forces by margins that grew worse each week. The scene that was about to unfold near Krinkelt represented far more than a tactical engagement between two armoured vehicles. It embodied a fundamental asymmetry that defined tank warfare in northwestern Europe during the winter of 1944 and 1945. American armour, particularly the M4 Sherman that formed the backbone of U.S. armoured divisions, operated under a strategic and tactical framework that emphasized mobility, mechanical reliability, and numerical superiority. German armour, especially the Panther and Tiger tanks that appeared with increasing frequency during the Battle of the Bulge, represented a different philosophy entirely. One built around technical superiority, heavy armour protection, and the concentrated striking power of guns that could penetrate Allied tanks at ranges where return fire proved ineffective. This morning, in the frozen forests of Belgium, those competing doctrines would collide with consequences that American tank crews had been quietly dreading since first encountering German heavy armour in Normandy 6 months earlier. But this engagement, and thousands like it during the desperate winter battles of 1944 and 1945, would also reveal an unexpected tactical solution, one that American forces would exploit with increasing sophistication as the campaign progressed. The question facing men like Lieutenant McConaughey was not whether they could defeat German armour in direct combat under ideal conditions, but whether they could survive long enough to call down the fire that would reveal their hidden enemy. To understand what happened in the forests around Krinkelt, and to grasp why American tankers approached German armour with such profound anxiety, requires examining the doctrinal foundations that shaped both armies' approach to armoured warfare. The United States Army entered World War II with tank doctrine heavily influenced by cavalry thinking and the experiences of World War I. American theorists conceived of the tank primarily as an exploitation weapon, a fast-moving force that would break through enemy lines and range deep into rear areas, disrupting communications and supply lines while avoiding direct combat with enemy armour whenever possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This doctrinal framework produced the M4 Sherman, a medium tank that entered production in 1942 and would become the most numerous American armoured fighting vehicle of the war. The Sherman was designed for reliability, ease of production, and operational mobility rather than for dueling with enemy heavy tanks. Its original 75mm M3 gun, derived from a French artillery piece, could fire high-explosive shells effectively against infantry and field fortifications, but struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of German medium and heavy tanks at combat ranges. The Sherman's armor protection reflected similar priorities. The frontal hull armor, measured 2 inches thick, sloped at 56 degrees to increase effective thickness through angling. This provided adequate protection against German anti-tank guns of 50mm or smaller caliber, and against most tank guns at longer ranges. But against the German 75mm KOK 42 gun mounted on the Panther, or the 88mm KOK 36 on the Tiger, Sherman armor offered little protection at typical combat ranges. American armored doctrine assigned the task of fighting enemy tanks primarily to tank destroyers, specialized vehicles mounting high-velocity guns on lightly armored, highly mobile chassis. Tank destroyers would theoretically respond to enemy armor concentrations, engaging German tanks with superior firepower, while Shermans focused on supporting infantry and exploiting breakthroughs. This division of labor looked logical on paper and reflected sound organizational thinking about specialization and resource allocation. In practice, the system proved far less effective than doctrine suggested. Tank destroyers often could not reach threatened sectors quickly enough to prevent German armor from savaging American tank formations. Enemy tanks appeared where intelligence had not predicted them, or attacked with such speed that tank destroyers arrived too late to influence the engagement. American tank crews found themselves facing German armor directly, forced to fight battles. Their vehicles were never designed to win under conditions that heavily favored their opponents. The German approach to armored warfare evolved along markedly different lines, shaped by different strategic circumstances and different tactical priorities. German tank designers prioritized firepower and armor protection over mobility and mechanical reliability, accepting lower production numbers and higher mechanical complexity in exchange for battlefield superiority in direct combat. This philosophy produced the Panzer Mark V Panther, which entered service in 1943 and quickly became the standard medium tank of German armored divisions. The Panther mounted a 75mm KWK 42 liters/70 gun, meaning the barrel length measured 70 times the caliber diameter, producing extremely high muzzle velocity and exceptional armor penetration. This gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Sherman at ranges exceeding 1 mile under ideal conditions, though typical combat engagement ranges in the close terrain of northwestern Europe rarely exceeded half that distance. Still, the capability margin remained overwhelming. A Panther could engage and destroy Shermans at ranges where American 75mm guns could not reliably penetrate Panther armor, even with flanking shots against the thinner side plates. The Panther's armor protection compounded this firepower advantage dramatically. Frontal hull armor, measured 3 1/5 inches thick, sloped at 55 degrees from vertical, creating effective thickness approaching 5 inches against direct frontal shots. The turret front carried 4 inches of armor. This protection scheme rendered the Panther nearly invulnerable to American 75mm tank guns firing standard armor-piercing ammunition at frontal aspects. American tankers learned through bitter experience that engaging a Panther from the front represented suicide unless they could maneuver to extreme close range and target specific weak points like the gun mantlet or lower hull plate. American intelligence officers and tank crews returning from Normandy brought back sobering reports about Panther capabilities that contradicted the optimistic assessments that had circulated earlier. Combat action reports documented instances where Shermans fired multiple rounds at Panthers from ranges under 500 yards without achieving penetration, while German tanks destroyed American armor with single shots at twice that distance. The kill ratio data told a grim story. Studies conducted after the Normandy campaign indicated that in direct engagements between Panthers and Shermans, German tanks destroyed American vehicles at ratios approaching 5-to-1 under favorable conditions for the Germans. These statistics circulated through American armored units with corrosive effect on morale. Tank crews understood intellectually that their mission emphasized supporting infantry and exploitation rather than tank versus tank combat. But this doctrinal distinction provided cold comfort when German armor appeared without warning and began methodically destroying American tanks before crews could effectively respond. The psychological burden of knowing that enemy tanks could kill you at ranges where you could not hurt them, that enemy armor could shrug off your best shots, while their shells would penetrate your protection with catastrophic results, created a pervasive anxiety that no amount of training or doctrinal explanation could fully overcome. By December of 1944, American tank crews operating in northwestern Europe had developed a realistic and thoroughly sobering appreciation for German armor capabilities. They understood that surviving encounters with Panthers or Tigers required avoiding direct engagement whenever possible, using numerical superiority to flank and overwhelm German tanks through coordinated maneuver, calling for air support or tank destroyer assistance, or exploiting the Panther's known mechanical unreliability by forcing German tanks to maneuver extensively and hope for breakdowns. These were the tactics of armies fighting from positions of material abundance but technological disadvantage, using numbers and logistics to overcome qualitative inferiority in key weapons systems. What American tank crews faced in the Ardennes during December of 1944 represented the tactical nightmare their training had inadequately prepared them for. The terrain itself favored the defender catastrophically. The forests of eastern Belgium and Luxembourg featured narrow roads cutting through dense pine woods, small villages surrounded by hedgerows and stone walls, and rolling hills that provided countless hull-down positions where a well-placed tank could observe approaching enemies while exposing only its turret. Visibility rarely exceeded a few hundred yards, often much less in the fog and snow that characterized the winter weather. German armor doctrine exploited these conditions with devastating efficiency. Panther and Tiger tanks moved into ambush positions during darkness, their commanders selecting firing positions that controlled key road junctions or narrow passages where American armor would have to funnel. The Germans understood that their numerical inferiority made mobile warfare suicidal. Instead, they fought from carefully prepared positions that maximized their advantages in firepower and armor protection, while negating American advantages in numbers and mobility. A typical engagement followed a pattern that became grimly familiar to American tankers during the first days of the German offensive. An American column would advance along a forest road, Shermans spaced at intervals doctrine specified, infantry following in half-tracks or moving through the trees on foot. The first indication of enemy presence would be the crack of a high-velocity gun and the metallic clang of a penetrating hit as an armor-piercing round punched through a Sherman's frontal plate. The targeted tank would often brew up immediately, ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions that sent flames shooting through open hatches. Survivors would bail out if they could, often under machine gun fire from German infantry supporting the ambush. The remaining American tanks faced a desperate tactical problem. They could see the muzzle flash from the German gun, but locating the actual tank proved extraordinarily difficult. Panthers used camouflage effectively, their dark grey paint schemes blending into shadowed forest backgrounds, their hulls concealed behind terrain features or buildings. American tank commanders, scanning desperately through their periscopes, would see only trees and shadows. Meanwhile, the German tank would fire again, and another Sherman would die. American doctrine called for immediate maneuver under these circumstances. Tanks were supposed to spread out, attempt to flank the enemy position, use smoke to obscure movement, and coordinate with supporting infantry to locate and suppress the German gun. But executing these maneuvers under fire, in close terrain, against an enemy who could kill your tank before you could effectively locate his position, required extraordinary courage and unit cohesion. Many American tank platoons, especially those from newly arrived divisions with limited combat experience, simply could not execute the required tactics under the psychological pressure of watching their vehicles destroyed one after another by an enemy they could not see clearly enough to engage. The material reality of armor penetration made these engagements even more psychologically devastating. When a German 75mm or 88mm armor-piercing round struck a Sherman, the results were catastrophic with horrifying regularity. The round would punch through the armor plate, creating a shower of white-hot steel fragments inside the crew compartment. These fragments would ricochet off internal surfaces, often igniting ammunition or fuel. Crew members were killed instantly by the initial penetration, by secondary fragments, or by the fire that followed. Survivors had seconds to escape before the entire vehicle became an inferno. Tank crews understood these realities with vivid clarity. They had seen burned-out Shermans along every road through France and Belgium, the hatches blown open, the paint scorched off, sometimes with the charred remains of crewmen still visible inside. They knew the statistics even if official sources tried to soften them. A Sherman hit by a Panther or Tiger gun had roughly a 60% chance of burning. Crew casualties in brewing tanks approached 75%. These were not abstract numbers, but lived realities that shaped every decision crews made about when to button up, when to keep hatches open for faster escape, how closely to follow doctrine that might leave them exposed. The American response to German ambush tactics evolved pragmatically through combat experience, rather than through doctrinal revision at higher headquarters. Tank crews, infantry officers, and forward. Artillery observers developed techniques that exploited American advantages in artillery support and ammunition supply to compensate for disadvantages in tank versus tank combat. The solution centered on white phosphorus, a chemical substance that would prove decisive not through its incendiary effects, but through an unexpected characteristic that transformed how American forces located and engaged German armor. White phosphorus munitions had been used by armies since World War I, primarily for their smoke-producing properties and secondary incendiary effects. When a white phosphorus shell burst, the chemical ignited spontaneously on contact with air, producing dense white smoke and particles that burned intensely and could not be easily extinguished. The United States Army employed white phosphorus in several munition types, including the M15 white phosphorus grenade and the M60 series artillery shells, in calibers from 75mm through 155mm. Artillery forward observers accompanying American tank units during the Ardennes fighting began employing white phosphorus shells in a novel tactical application that emerged from desperate necessity rather than formal doctrine. When American tanks encountered German armor firing from concealed positions, the standard response of attempting to locate and engage the enemy directly often failed, as described earlier. Forward observers began calling for white phosphorus fire missions targeted on suspected German positions, not primarily to kill enemy crews, but to mark their locations and force them to reveal themselves. The technique worked with remarkable effectiveness for several interconnected reasons. When white phosphorus rounds burst near or on a tank position, they produced enormous clouds of dense white smoke that completely obscured visibility. A Panther commander sitting in his turret, watching American tanks through his optics, would suddenly find his vision blocked by impenetrable white smoke as phosphorus shells burst around his position. The smoke persisted for several minutes, denying the German crew the clear observation they required for accurate, long-range gunnery. More critically, white phosphorus particles landing on a tank's metal surfaces would continue burning intensely, producing highly visible white smoke trails that marked the tank's position unmistakably. A Panther that had been nearly invisible in forest shadows would suddenly be marked by multiple columns of white smoke rising from its hull and turret wherever phosphorus particles had landed. American tanks that could not locate their enemy moments earlier now had a clearly marked target that remained visible even as the main smoke cloud dissipated. The psychological and tactical effects on German tank crews proved devastating. Panthers and Tigers were designed to fight from static positions, using their superior guns and armor to destroy enemy tanks at range while remaining concealed. White phosphorus fire eliminated concealment entirely, marking German positions with smoke visible for hundreds of yards. German crews faced an immediate tactical dilemma. They could remain in position, now clearly marked and vulnerable to concentrated fire from multiple American tanks and supporting weapons, or they could move to escape the marked position. Movement solved one problem but created others that often proved worse. German tanks moving to escape white phosphorus, marking exposed their thinner side and rear armor to American fire. Panthers, particularly vulnerable on the sides, where armor thickness dropped to 1 6/10 inches, could be penetrated by American 75mm guns at typical combat ranges when struck at perpendicular angles. A Panther, moving to escape smoke marking, often presented exactly such a target to American tanks that had maneuvered to flanking positions while the German crew's vision was obscured. Furthermore, movement revealed German positions to American artillery observers, who could then call for high-explosive fire missions. American artillery operated with sophistication and responsiveness that German forces could not match by late 1944. Forward observers could request fire missions and receive shells on target within minutes. A Panther forced to move by white phosphorus would find itself under high-explosive artillery fire that, while unlikely to penetrate the tank's armor directly, could damage vision devices, injure exposed crew members, destroy the engine deck, or sever the tank's tracks and immobilize it. The tactical calculus shifted decisively in favor of American forces once white phosphorus became standard procedure for dealing with ambushes. German tank commanders could no longer simply wait in ambush positions, destroy several American tanks, and withdraw before effective countermeasures arrived. Now, the first shots from a German ambush would be followed within minutes by white phosphorus fire that marked the position and forced movement. American tanks, operating in platoon or company strength, could coordinate their fire against the now visible target, accepting the risk of frontal engagement because they had numbers and could bring overwhelming fire to bear. The first systematic use of white phosphorus to reveal German armor positions appears to have occurred during the fighting around the twin villages of Rocherath-Krinkelt on December 17th and 18th, 1944. The 2nd Infantry Division and attached armour faced attacks by the 1st SS Panzer Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division, formations equipped with Panthers and supported by Tiger tanks from heavy tank battalions. The terrain around these villages provided German armour with ideal ambush positions, and initial engagements followed the pattern described earlier, with German tanks destroying American Shermans from concealed firing positions. Artillery forward observers, with the 2nd Division, began calling for white phosphorus fire missions on suspected German tank positions after locating approximate positions through muzzle flash observation and sound ranging. The results exceeded their expectations dramatically. Panthers that had been nearly impossible to locate before the phosphorus fire became clearly marked targets as burning particles clung to their hulls and turrets. American tank platoons, previously unable to concentrate fire effectively against enemies they could barely see, now engaged clearly marked targets with multiple tanks firing simultaneously. Combat reports from units engaged in this fighting document the tactical transformation. The 2nd Battalion, 38th Infantry Regiment, reported that white phosphorus fire enabled their supporting tanks to locate and engage German armour that had previously destroyed American vehicles with impunity. Tank commanders reported that once German positions were marked with phosphorus, they could maneuver their platoons to achieve flanking positions, while the German crews remained buttoned up and effectively blind from the smoke. The technique spread rapidly through American armoured units, as word of its effectiveness circulated during the desperate fighting of December 1944. Tank company commanders began requesting that forward observers accompany their formations specifically to call white phosphorus fire missions when German armour appeared. Artillery battalions adjusted their ammunition loads to ensure adequate supplies of white phosphorus shells remained available for marking missions. By early January of 1945, the use of white phosphorus to reveal German tank positions had become standard tactical procedure throughout 1st and 3rd Armies, operating in the Ardennes sector. German responses to this tactical innovation revealed the fundamental constraints they operated under by the winter of 1944 and 45. Panther and Tiger crews could not simply withdraw and relocate every time they faced white phosphorus fire. German armour operated with severe fuel shortages that limited unnecessary movement. Mechanical reliability problems meant that each repositioning risked breakdowns that could immobilize tanks far from repair facilities. Most critically, German armoured formations lacked the numerical strength to trade space for survival the way Soviet forces had done earlier in the war. German tank commanders developed limited countermeasures. Some attempted to position their tanks with quick escape routes planned in advance, allowing rapid withdrawal when marked by phosphorus. Others tried to maintain greater distances from American forces, engaging at extreme ranges where phosphorus fire proved less accurate. A few units experimented with dummy positions and decoys, hoping to draw phosphorus fire onto false targets. None of these measures proved particularly effective against American forces that had adjusted their tactics around white phosphorus marking. The broader implications of this tactical innovation extended beyond immediate battlefield results. White phosphorus marking represented a characteristically American solution to a tactical problem, one that relied on material abundance rather than technical sophistication. The United States could afford to fire hundreds of specialized smoke shells to mark a single tank position because American industry produced artillery ammunition in quantities that seemed almost incomprehensible to German forces. American artillery battalions operated with the confidence that ammunition would be replenished rapidly, regardless of expenditure rates, allowing forward observers to call for fire missions liberally, without concern for conservation. This abundance mentality permeated American tactical thinking at every level and shaped solutions to problems in ways that German forces, operating under severe material constraints, could not replicate even if they recognized the effectiveness of American techniques. The white phosphorus marking technique required not just the shells themselves, but the entire logistical infrastructure that ensured those shells reached forward artillery positions in sufficient quantities to be employed routinely, rather than hoarded for critical moments. The tactical effectiveness of white phosphorus marking translated into measurable shifts in armor engagement outcomes during the final months of fighting in northwestern Europe. Combat loss data from American armored divisions operating in the Ardennes and subsequent operations into Germany during January through March of 1945 show notable improvements in tank loss ratios compared to the Normandy campaign. While direct causation proves difficult to establish definitively, given the multiple variables affecting combat outcomes, after-action reports consistently cite improved ability to locate and engage German armor as a contributing factor to reduced American losses. The 2nd Armored Division, which fought extensively in the Ardennes and participated in subsequent operations crossing the Ruhr River and advancing toward the Rhine, reported tank loss ratios against German armor that improved from approximately 4.5 American tanks lost per German tank destroyed in Normandy to roughly 2.8 to 1 during the winter and spring campaigns of 1945. Unit historians specifically noted the contribution of artillery support and improved smoke employment in these improved outcomes, though they also acknowledged that declining German fuel supplies, reduced crew training quality, and American numerical superiority all played significant roles. The psychological impact on American tank crews proved equally significant, though harder to quantify through official records. Crews who had felt helpless against German ambush tactics now possessed a concrete response that provided at least some agency in encounters with superior enemy armor. The knowledge that artillery could mark enemy positions and force German tanks to move or fight at disadvantage reduced, though certainly did not eliminate, the pervasive anxiety that characterized earlier combat against Panthers and Tigers. Tank commanders interviewed after the war frequently mentioned artillery support and smoke employment as critical factors in their survival and effectiveness. German perspectives on the American use of white phosphorus reveal the frustration of tactically competent forces confronting enemies who could compensate for qualitative disadvantages through material abundance. German after-action reports from armored units engaged in the Ardennes fighting complained repeatedly about American artillery fire that prevented effective use of ambush positions and forced premature withdrawal or exposure. Panther and Tiger commanders noted that American forces had developed countermeasures to German armor tactics that relied not on superior tanks, but on coordination between armor, infantry, and particularly artillery, that German forces could not match given their resource constraints. Hans von Luck, who commanded armored formations during the final campaigns in the West, wrote in his post-war memoir about the fundamental asymmetry that characterized fighting against American forces by 1945. German units could achieve local tactical superiority through skill and superior equipment, he noted, but American forces responded to tactical setbacks not with retreat, but with overwhelming firepower that negated German advantages. He specifically mentioned American artillery and its seemingly unlimited ammunition supply as the most dangerous capability American forces possessed, more threatening in aggregate than any particular weapons system. The white phosphorus marking technique represented a microcosm of how American forces fought the war in Europe, using material superiority and systematic coordination to overcome German advantages in specific weapons or tactical situations. American tank crews never achieved parity with German heavy armor in direct combat under ideal conditions. A Sherman remained inferior to a Panther in gun penetration, armor protection, and individual combat power throughout the war. But American forces rarely fought under ideal conditions or in isolated tank versus tank duels. They fought as combined arms teams with lavish artillery support, air superiority when weather permitted, and logistical sustainment that ensured ammunition, fuel, and replacement vehicles remained available regardless of expenditure rates. This approach to warfare reflected fundamental differences in how American and German military establishments conceived of combat effectiveness. German doctrine emphasized the qualitative superiority of individual weapons systems and the tactical skill of small units exploiting that superiority. American doctrine emphasized systems integration, overwhelming firepower, and the ability to sustain operations through superior logistics. Neither approach was inherently superior in abstract terms, but under the specific conditions of the European theater in 1945, the American model proved decisively more effective. The story of white phosphorus, revealing German tank positions, while tactically significant, represented only one small element of the larger Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge and subsequent campaigns. The German offensive that began on December 16, 1944 ultimately failed, not because of any single tactical innovation or weapon system, but because of fundamental strategic and material imbalances that no amount of tactical skill or operational surprise could overcome. The Wehrmacht committed its last mobile reserves to the Ardennes offensive, achieving initial surprise and tactical success, but ultimately exhausting itself against American resistance that proved far more resilient than German planning had anticipated. American forces suffered approximately 75,000 casualties during the Bulge fighting, including nearly 9,000 killed. Tank losses approached 700 vehicles destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. These were painful losses that affected units across 1st and 3rd Armies and required weeks to replace fully. But American replacement systems, supply networks, and industrial production absorbed these losses and reconstituted damaged units with remarkable speed. By late January of 1945, American armored divisions that had been savaged during December were back to full strength with replacement tanks, crews, and equipment. German losses proved catastrophic and irreplaceable. The 6th Panzer Army and 5th Panzer Army, which spearheaded the offensive, lost approximately 600 tanks and assault guns during the campaign, along with thousands of other vehicles, and virtually all their fuel reserves. More critically, they lost approximately 67,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, including experienced crew members and officers who could not be replaced. German armoured divisions that limped back to their starting positions in late January were shadows of their former strength, lacking fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and above all the trained personnel necessary for effective combat operations. The Ardennes offensive represented Germany's last major attack in the West. After January of 1945, German forces in northwestern Europe fought a purely defensive campaign, characterized by steady retreat, punctuated by occasional local counterattacks that achieved temporary tactical success but could not influence strategic outcomes. American and British forces crossed the Rhine in March, surrounded and destroyed German Army Group B in the Ruhr pocket in April, and advanced deep into Germany against collapsing resistance. German armoured forces that had fought with such effectiveness during the early stages of the Bulge increasingly fell victim to mechanical breakdowns, fuel exhaustion, and abandonment as organised German military resistance dissolved. The white phosphorus marking technique continued proving effective during these final campaigns, but its importance diminished as German resistance weakened and American tactical air power, grounded during much of the Bulge fighting by poor weather, returned to dominance of the battlefield. Fighter bombers armed with rockets and bombs proved even more effective than artillery at destroying German armor once they could operate freely, and by April of 1945, German tank commanders faced threats from above that proved far more deadly than white phosphorus marking from the ground. The Sherman tank, despite its well-documented limitations against German heavy armor, served throughout the war's end and into occupation duties afterward. American armored forces fielded improved variants, including the M4, A3E8, with wider tracks, improved suspension, and the higher velocity 76mm gun that could penetrate Panther armor at reasonable combat ranges. But even the original 75mm armed Shermans remained in frontline service, their reliability and ease of maintenance proving more valuable in sustained operations than the superior combat power of heavier, more complex designs. The fundamental lesson of the Sherman versus Panther story, and the white phosphorus innovation that emerged from that unequal contest, concerned not the superiority of any particular weapon system, but the decisive importance of tactical flexibility, combined arms coordination, and logistical sustainability in modern mechanized warfare. German armored forces achieved remarkable tactical successes throughout the war, through superior equipment and highly trained crews, but tactical excellence could not compensate for strategic overextension, industrial inadequacy, and the fundamental material imbalances that characterized the war by 1944. American forces, conversely, often fought with equipment that proved inferior in direct comparison to German equivalents, but won through systematic advantages in logistics, artillery support, tactical air power, and the ability to replace losses and sustain operations indefinitely. The Sherman was not a better tank than the Panther in any direct measure of combat power, but American forces employed Shermans as components of an integrated combat system that proved superior to German approaches under the actual conditions of combat in Western Europe. Lieutenant William McConaughey survived the Battle of the Bulge and the subsequent drive into Germany. His tank, the M4A1 that had sat vulnerably on that forest road near Krinkelt in December of 1944, was destroyed by a Panther during the initial German assault, forcing McConaughey and his crew to bail out under machine gun fire. He received a replacement Sherman within 3 days and returned to combat, fighting through the reduction of the Bulge salient and participating in the Rhine crossing in March of 1945. He was wounded by shell fragments near Paderborn in April, but survived and returned home to Pennsylvania after Germany's surrender. In interviews conducted decades after the war, McConaughey spoke candidly about the fear American tank crews felt when facing German armor, particularly during the early stages of engagements when German tanks remained concealed and nearly invisible. He credited artillery support, specifically white phosphorus marking fire, with saving his life on multiple occasions during the winter fighting. Once German positions were marked with phosphorus smoke, he recalled, American tanks could coordinate their fire and maneuver effectively. Before that innovation became standard practice, encounters with German heavy tanks felt like being hunted by an enemy you could not see clearly enough to fight back against. Oberleutnant Hans Becker, the Panther commander who had waited in ambush that December morning, fought through the Bulge and withdrew with the remnants of 1st SS Panzer Division into Germany. His Panther was abandoned near the Rhine in March of 1945, after suffering engine failure that could not be repaired for lack of spare parts. He survived the war and returned to civilian life, though he rarely spoke publicly about his military service. In private correspondence with a military historian during the 1970s, he acknowledged that by the winter of 1945, German armored forces faced impossible tactical situations regardless of the quality of their equipment. American artillery fire made static defensive positions untenable, while fuel shortages prevented the mobile warfare that might have exploited German advantages in armor quality. The broader legacy of the white phosphorus innovation extended beyond World War II into subsequent conflicts, where American forces again faced enemies with superior weapons in specific categories. During the Korean War, American tank crews encountered Soviet-supplied T-34-85 tanks that outgunned the M24 Chaffee light tanks initially available to United Nations forces. American forces again relied on artillery support and coordination, rather than tank versus tank combat, to defeat enemy armor. Similar patterns emerged in later conflicts, where American tactical doctrine emphasized combined arms integration and overwhelming firepower, rather than seeking parity in individual weapons categories. The fundamental insight that emerged from the Sherman versus Panther encounters and the improvisational solution that white phosphorus marking represented concerned the nature of combat effectiveness in modern warfare. Superior equipment provides significant advantages in specific tactical situations, but those advantages can be negated or overcome through tactical innovation, superior coordination, and systematic exploitation of broader capabilities that inferior forces cannot match. German tank crews fought with extraordinary courage and tactical skill using superior equipment, but they operated within a military system that lacked the logistical depth, material reserves, and systematic coordination that characterized American operations by the war's final year. The story that began on that frozen December morning near Krinkelt, with Lieutenant McConaughey scanning desperately for an enemy he could not clearly see while a Panther commander waited in perfect ambush position, ended not with German tactical superiority proving decisive, but with American forces developing countermeasures that transformed the tactical equation. White phosphorus shells, fired in abundance by American artillery that never lacked ammunition, revealed German positions and forced movement that exposed vulnerabilities. The technique represented characteristically American problem-solving: pragmatic, materially intensive, and reliant on abundance rather than elegance. That morning, in December of 1944, Hans Becker's Panther destroyed 2 American Shermans, before white phosphorus fire marked his position with unmistakable columns of white smoke. He withdrew under covering fire from supporting Panthers, avoiding destruction but abandoning the ambush position that had provided such decisive advantage minutes earlier. The tactical superiority his tank represented in isolation proved insufficient against an enemy who could call down fire that eliminated concealment and forced exactly the kind of mobile engagement where American numerical superiority proved decisive. The revelation was not that German tanks were inferior, they were not, but that tactical excellence and superior equipment could not overcome systematic disadvantages in firepower, logistics, and material abundance. That lesson, learned in the frozen forests of Belgium during the winter of 1944 and 1945, would echo through subsequent decades of American military doctrine and operational practice. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.